I watched my younger sister Rachel walk into the courtroom with her expensive attorney, knowing she was about to destroy everything I had left. My parents sat behind her, my mother dabbing her eyes with tissues, while my father nodded grimly at whatever lies they had rehearsed. The family estate worth $2 million hung in the balance, and according to them, I deserved absolutely nothing, despite caring for our grandmother for 8 years, while they lived their comfortable lives 3 states away. My name is Charity, and if someone had told me 3 years ago that my own family would orchestrate the most elaborate betrayal I could imagine, I would have laughed at the absurdity. But here I was, 36 years old, sitting in a mahogany-paneled courtroom, watching my sister's lawyer arrange documents that could strip away every sacrifice I had made for the woman who raised us. The story began when I was 28 and working as a marketing coordinator for a successful firm in Chicago. I had everything figured out: a corner office on the 32nd floor, a serious relationship with Jake Morrison, a software engineer who talked about marriage, and a downtown apartment with exposed brick walls that I absolutely loved. Life felt perfect until that phone call on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. "Charity, honey, it's about your grandmother." My mother, Susan's voice crackled through the phone. "She's had a massive stroke. The doctors say she needs round-the-clock care and we just don't know what to do." Grandma Dorothy had been the anchor of our family since I was 5 years old. After my grandfather passed away, she moved into the big Victorian house, where my sister Rachel and I spent every summer, every holiday, every moment, when life felt uncertain. She taught me to bake apple pies from scratch, helped me with algebra homework when my parents were too busy, and listened to my teenage heartbreaks with endless patience. "Where are you calling from?" I asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. "We're at the hospital in Tampa. Your father and I drove up from our place in Sarasota, but Charity, we're 65 years old. We can't handle this kind of responsibility anymore. Your father's back problems, my arthritis, the stress would be too much." I stared out my office window at the bustling streets below, watching people hurry past with their own urgent lives. "What about Rachel? She's closer to Grandma's house in Michigan. You know your sister. She's got that big audition coming up for the television pilot, and her agent says this could be her breakthrough role. We can't ask her to give up her dreams." The weight of expectation settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. Rachel had been chasing acting success in Los Angeles for 6 years, living in a studio apartment and working part-time jobs while attending endless casting calls. She visited Grandma maybe twice a year, usually when she needed money or a place to stay between apartments. I made the decision that would change everything. Within 2 weeks, I had quit my job, broken my lease, and moved back to the small town of Millbrook, Michigan, where Grandma Dorothy's 3-story house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Jake tried to understand, but long-distance relationships rarely survive major life upheavals. "I support what you're doing, Charity, but I can't put my life on hold indefinitely," he said during our final video call. His words stung because they were reasonable, which made the rejection even harder to accept. For 8 years, I became Grandma Dorothy's world. I learned to administer her medication schedule, physical therapy appointments, and help her navigate the daily challenges of limited mobility. Her speech came back gradually, but her left side remained weak, requiring assistance with everything from bathing to getting dressed. We developed routines that brought us both comfort. Tuesday mornings meant grocery shopping at the local market, where Mrs. Patterson behind the deli counter always asked about Grandma's health. Wednesday afternoons involved gentle walks around the neighborhood when weather permitted stopping to chat with neighbors who had watched me grow up. Thursday evenings were reserved for old movies and homemade popcorn in the living room. Rachel called sporadically, usually when she needed emotional support after failed auditions or relationship drama. Her visits became annual events, typically lasting 2 or 3 days before she grew restless and returned to California. During these brief appearances, she would take selfies with Grandma for social media posts about family time and cherishing precious moments. My parents established a pattern of quarterly visits staying at the nearby Holiday Inn because they claimed Grandma's house was too difficult to navigate with their age-related mobility issues. They would spend one afternoon visiting, bring flowers from the grocery store, and leave the next morning with promises to call more often. The financial reality of caregiving hit hard. Grandma's Social Security and pension covered basic expenses, but medical costs, home modifications, and my living expenses created constant pressure. I took freelance marketing projects when possible, but my primary focus remained on ensuring Grandma's comfort and dignity. Last October, Grandma Dorothy suffered another stroke, this one more severe. She spent 2 weeks in intensive care while doctors explained her prognosis with clinical detachment. Her quality of life will be significantly compromised, the neurologist informed us during a family conference call. You should consider your options carefully. Rachel flew in from Los Angeles crying dramatically in the hospital corridor. I should have spent more time with her, she sobbed, attracting sympathetic glances from passing nurses. I've been so selfish, focused on my career while charity handled everything. Grandma Dorothy passed away peacefully on a Sunday morning in November, holding my hand while I read her favorite poetry. Rachel arrived 6 hours later, immediately taking charge of funeral arrangements and social media announcements about our devastating loss. The will reading occurred 3 weeks later in attorney Harold Pemberton's downtown office. Mr. Pemberton had been Grandma's lawyer for 25 years, a dignified man in his 70s who spoke with careful precision. Dorothy Henderson's will is straightforward, he announced, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The house, all contents, and financial assets totaling approximately $2 million are to be divided equally between her granddaughter's charity and Rachel Henderson. My relief was immediate. After 8 years of sacrifice, Grandma had ensured my financial security. $1 million would allow me to rebuild my life, maybe return to school, definitely find a place of my own where I could start fresh. Rachel's response surprised everyone. I need to speak with my own attorney before accepting anything, she declared. This situation feels complicated, and I want to make sure everything was handled properly. 3 months later, her lawyer contacted me with devastating news. Rachel was contesting the will, claiming I had manipulated our dying grandmother and possibly forged documents to increase my inheritance. She was demanding a complete investigation, and worse, she had evidence that made her accusations seem credible. Now sitting in Judge Quinn's courtroom with my own attorney, Mark Stevens, I watch my sister's legal team prepare for systematic character assassination. Mark had warned me that family inheritance disputes often become ugly, but nothing could have prepared me for the betrayal I was about to witness. Rachel's attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Victoria Hayes, stood up with confident precision. Your Honor, we have compelling evidence that Miss Charity Henderson engaged in systematic fraud and manipulation of an elderly, vulnerable woman. Security footage, banking records, and witness testimony will demonstrate a pattern of financial abuse that continued until Mrs. Henderson's death. My stomach dropped as she continued. Furthermore, we have evidence suggesting that Miss Henderson forged her grandmother's signature on a codicil that illegally increased her inheritance from 50% to 75%. Bank security cameras captured someone matching Miss Henderson's description, making unauthorized visits to safe deposit boxes during her grandmother's final weeks. Mark Stevens gripped his pen tighter, his usual calm demeanor showing cracks. Your Honor, these accusations are baseless and deeply hurtful to my client, who sacrificed 8 years of her life, caring for her grandmother with love and dedication. But Judge Quinn looked skeptical as he reviewed the preliminary evidence. The foundation of everything I believed about my family, my sacrifice, and my grandmother's love was about to crumble in ways I never could have imagined. Victoria Hayes moved through her presentation with surgical precision, each piece of evidence designed to paint me as a calculating predator who had systematically isolated and manipulated our grandmother. The courtroom felt smaller with each revelation, the walls closing in as my reputation disintegrated before a room full of strangers. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to examine these bank records carefully. She announced distributing packets to the judge and jury. You'll notice a series of unusual cash deposits into Miss Charity Henderson's personal account, totaling $37,000 over the past 2 years. These deposits occurred immediately following withdrawals from Mrs. Dorothy Henderson's accounts. I watched the jurors study the documents, their expressions shifting from neutral curiosity to suspicious concern. The numbers were accurate, but the context was completely wrong. Those deposits represented reimbursements for medical expenses, home modifications, and groceries I had purchased with my own credit cards, when Grandma's checking account was temporarily frozen due to a banking error. Now let's examine the security footage from First National Bank. Victoria continued clicking a remote that activated a large screen. This enhanced video shows a woman of Miss Henderson's approximate height and build accessing Mrs. Henderson's safe deposit box on 3 separate occasions during November, just weeks before the elderly woman's death. The grainy footage played in slow motion, showing a figure in dark clothing and sunglasses entering the bank's vault area. The woman's hair color and general build did resemble mine, but the image quality made positive identification impossible. Still, I could see several jurors leaning forward studying the screen intently. Our handwriting expert, Dr. Margaret Thornton, has analyzed the codicil in question. Victoria announced as an elderly woman approached the witness stand. Dr. Thornton wore thick glasses and carried herself with academic authority. After examining multiple samples of Mrs. Henderson's authentic signatures spanning 20 years, Dr. Thornton testified, "I found significant inconsistencies in the codicil signature. The pressure variations letter formations and overall flow suggest someone attempting to replicate Mrs. Henderson's handwriting rather than her natural signing process." My heart pounded as Mark Stevens cross-examined the expert, but her credentials were impressive and her analysis seemed thorough. The codicil in question was a document I had never seen before, supposedly increasing my inheritance percentage, and signed just 2 weeks before Grandma's death. "I never saw that document," I whispered to Mark during a brief recess. "Grandma never mentioned changing her will again after the original signing 3 years ago." "They're building a comprehensive fraud case," Mark replied grimly. "Someone has spent considerable time and money putting this together." The afternoon session brought character witnesses, each testimony more damaging than the last. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, who lived next door to Grandma's house, took the stand with obvious reluctance. "I hate to say anything negative about Charity." She began, her voice wavering. "But over the past 2 years, I noticed changes in how Dorothy interacted with visitors. Charity always seemed to hover nearby, monitoring conversations, sometimes interrupting when Dorothy tried to speak privately with family members." "Can you give us a specific example?" Victoria prompted. "Last Christmas, when Rachel and her parents came to visit, I was bringing over a fruit basket. I heard Charity telling Dorothy that her family was only interested in her money, that they didn't really care about her welfare. It seemed like she was trying to turn Dorothy against her own children." The testimony felt like physical blows. Mrs. Caldwell had been our neighbor for 15 years, someone I considered a family friend. Her words carried weight because everyone knew she had no personal stake in the inheritance dispute. Dr. Patricia Simmons, a former home health aide, delivered even more devastating testimony. "I worked with Mrs. Henderson for 6 months before Miss Charity Henderson terminated my services," she explained. "In my professional opinion, Miss Henderson was creating deliberate isolation around her grandmother, limiting outside contact and medical oversight." "What led to your termination?" Victoria asked. I expressed concerns about Mrs. Henderson's medication schedule and suggested she might benefit from physical therapy at a community center where she could socialize with other seniors. Miss Charity Henderson became very defensive and accused me of interfering in family matters. She fired me the next day. Mark's cross-examination revealed that Dr. Simmons had been terminated for arriving late multiple times and suggesting expensive treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, but the damage was done. The jury heard only that I had fired a medical professional who tried to help Grandma. As the day progressed, I began to understand the scope of what I was facing. This wasn't a simple inheritance dispute between siblings. Someone had carefully constructed a narrative that portrayed me as a master manipulator who had systematically isolated our grandmother while positioning myself to inherit everything. The most shocking moment came near the end of the day when Victoria announced her final piece of evidence. "Your Honor, we have obtained phone records that show multiple calls between Miss Henderson and a known document forger operating out of Detroit. These calls occurred during the same time period when Mrs. Henderson's will was allegedly modified." She handed printed records to the judge and jury highlighting specific numbers and dates. Furthermore, credit card records show that Miss Henderson made 3 unexplained trips to Detroit during her grandmother's final months. She rented cars, stayed in hotels, and paid cash for services that remain unaccounted for. I stared at the evidence in disbelief. The phone numbers were unfamiliar, and I had never been to Detroit during the time period in question. Yet the records clearly showed calls originating from my cell phone and credit card charges in my name. "Those aren't my charges," I whispered urgently to Mark. "Someone has been using my identity." But even as I spoke the words, I realized how desperate they sounded. The evidence was comprehensive, detailed, and seemingly irrefutable. Phone records, bank statements, credit card bills, and witness testimony all pointed to the same conclusion: I had methodically defrauded our grandmother while presenting myself as her devoted caregiver. Rachel watched the proceedings from the plaintiff's table, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes as the evidence mounted against me. Her performance was Oscar-worthy, the grieving granddaughter who had discovered terrible truths about her sister's behavior. During the final recess, Mark pulled me aside for a frank conversation. "Charity, I've been practicing family law for 20 years, and this is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've ever seen. If we can't find holes in their evidence or present compelling counter-arguments, you're not only going to lose the inheritance, you could face criminal charges." The weight of my situation settled fully. I wasn't just fighting for Grandma's money anymore. I was fighting for my freedom, my reputation, and any hope of rebuilding my life. Someone had spent months, possibly years, planning my destruction with methodical precision. As court adjourned for the day, I realized that tomorrow would bring even more devastating revelations. Victoria Hayes looked satisfied with her presentation, confident that she had already won. Rachel hugged our parents in the hallway, all 3 of them maintaining the perfect image of a family seeking justice against a manipulative fraud. But something nagged at me as I drove home to my small rental apartment. The evidence was almost too perfect, too comprehensive, too neatly packaged. Real fraud cases usually involved sloppy mistakes, obvious inconsistencies, and clear motives. This felt different, like someone had studied fraud cases and created the perfect deception. I spent that evening reviewing every detail I could remember about Grandma's final months, searching for anything that might explain how my sister had constructed such an elaborate frame-up. Because despite the overwhelming evidence, I knew one absolute truth: I had never betrayed the woman who had been my second mother, and I would find a way to prove it. The second day of trial began with Judge Quinn's stern warning about courtroom decorum, though the packed gallery remained tense with anticipation. Word had spread through our small community about the Henderson family drama, and I recognized several familiar faces among the spectators, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed judgment. Victoria Hayes opened with her most damaging evidence yet. "Your Honor, yesterday we established a pattern of financial manipulation and document forgery. Today we will demonstrate the psychological manipulation that enabled these crimes through recorded conversations and additional witness testimony." My stomach clenched as she approached a small audio device on the evidence table. This recording was obtained legally through security cameras with audio capability installed in Mrs. Henderson's home for safety purposes during her final weeks. The sound quality was surprisingly clear as my voice filled the courtroom. "Grandma, you know I'm the only one who really cares about you. Rachel's just waiting for you to die so she can take your money and run back to California. Mom and Dad are the same way, they only visit when they feel guilty." My face burned with shame as the recording continued. "I've been thinking about your will situation. Maybe we should make sure the paperwork reflects who actually deserves to inherit everything. I mean, I've given up my whole life to take care of you." The jury's reaction was immediate and devastating. Several members shook their heads in disgust, and one elderly woman placed her hand over her heart as if physically pained by what she was hearing. "I never said those things." I whispered desperately to Mark, but even as I spoke, doubt crept into my mind. The voice sounded exactly like mine, down to specific speech patterns and vocal inflections that would be impossible to fake. Victoria wasn't finished. "We also have this conversation from 2 weeks before Mrs. Henderson's death, recorded in her bedroom during what Miss Henderson believed was a private moment." Again, my voice echoed through the courtroom. "I need to make sure everything is taken care of with the will changes. That lawyer downtown is asking too many questions, but I found someone in Detroit who handles these kinds of situations discreetly. The old lady won't even remember signing the new papers by tomorrow." The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations until Judge Quinn's gavel restored order. I felt physically sick watching jurors stare at me with undisguised revulsion. The recordings were impossible to explain away because they sounded completely authentic. Mark Stevens requested an immediate sidebar conference, arguing that the recordings' chain of custody was questionable and their authenticity unverified. But Judge Quinn seemed convinced by the technical documentation Victoria provided. The recordings were made by a legitimate security company hired by concerned family members, Victoria explained. All equipment was installed with Mrs. Henderson's written consent as part of her medical safety plan. When testimony resumed, Rachel took the witness stand with perfectly orchestrated emotion. She wore a simple black dress and minimal makeup, the grieving granddaughter seeking justice for beloved family member. Charity was always the responsible one. Rachel began, her voice breaking slightly. "When Grandma had her stroke, I thought it was wonderful that my sister was willing to care for her. I trusted Charity completely because she seemed so devoted and loving." "When did you first suspect something was wrong?" Victoria prompted gently. "About 18 months ago, I called Grandma to wish her happy birthday, and Charity answered the phone. She said Grandma was sleeping, but I could hear her in the background asking who was calling. Charity told her it was a telemarketer and hung up without letting us talk." Rachel dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "I started calling at different times, but Charity always had excuses. Grandma was napping or at physical therapy or not feeling well enough for visitors. When I did reach Grandma directly, she seemed confused about family events and said things like, 'Rachel never calls anymore,' or 'Your parents don't care about me.' Did you confront your sister about this?" "I tried, but Charity got very defensive. She said I was being paranoid and that caring for Grandma was stressful enough without family members questioning her methods. She made me feel guilty for even asking questions." Rachel's testimony continued for over an hour, painting a picture of systematic isolation and psychological manipulation. She described phone calls where Grandma seemed increasingly dependent on me and suspicious of other family members. "The worst part was watching Grandma change," Rachel concluded. "She went from being this independent, sharp woman to someone who couldn't make decisions without Charity's approval. It was like watching someone lose their personality." My parents' testimony proved equally devastating. My father, Robert Henderson, looked distinguished in his Navy suit as he approached the witness stand with obvious reluctance. "This is incredibly difficult." He began, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "Charity was always our responsible daughter, the one we could count on. When Dorothy needed care, we never questioned Charity's motives because she seemed genuinely loving." "When did your perspective change?" Victoria asked. "About a year ago, Dorothy called us at 3 a.m, crying and confused. She said Charity was keeping her locked in the house and wouldn't let her see doctors of her own choosing. She begged us to visit, but when we arrived the next day, Dorothy seemed to have no memory of the phone call." My father's voice cracked with emotion. Charity explained that Dorothy was having episodes related to her medication, but something felt wrong. Dorothy kept looking at Charity nervously, like she was afraid to speak freely. My mother Susan's testimony was even more heartbreaking. She approached the witness stand wearing a simple gray dress. Her silver hair perfectly styled the image of a grieving mother forced to testify against her own daughter. I raised Charity to be caring and responsible. She began, tears already forming in her eyes. When she volunteered to care for Dorothy, I was so proud. But over time, I noticed changes that worried me deeply. What kind of changes? Dorothy stopped calling us regularly, which was unusual because she had always been the family communicator. When we did talk, she seemed anxious and would often lower her voice like she was afraid someone might overhear. My mother's voice broke completely as she continued. During our last visit, I found Dorothy crying in her bedroom. When I asked what was wrong, she whispered that she was afraid Charity was planning something, but couldn't remember what. She seemed terrified, but then Charity walked in and Dorothy immediately stopped talking. What was your response to these concerns? We tried to discuss it with Charity, but she became very angry and accused us of not trusting her judgment. She said we were trying to undermine her authority as Dorothy's primary caregiver. We backed down because we didn't want to create more stress for Dorothy. The jury's sympathy for my parents was obvious. Here were elderly adults forced to testify against their own daughter, clearly devastated by the betrayal they were describing. Mark Stevens' cross-examination attempted to highlight inconsistencies in their testimony, but my parents remained composed and believable. They admitted to living 3 states away and visiting infrequently, but portrayed these choices as respect for my caregiving role, rather than neglect of their own responsibilities. The day's final witness was Dr. Amanda Foster, a geriatric psychiatrist who had reviewed Grandma Dorothy's medical records and the audio recordings. Based on my analysis, Dr. Foster testified, Mrs. Henderson showed clear signs of psychological manipulation and elder abuse. The isolation from family members, dependency on a single caregiver, and fearful behavior patterns are classic indicators of systematic emotional manipulation. In your professional opinion, was Mrs. Henderson competent to make financial decisions during her final months? The medical records suggest significant cognitive decline accelerated by psychological stress. Someone in her condition would be extremely vulnerable to manipulation, especially from a trusted family member who controlled her daily environment. As court adjourned for the day, I felt completely defeated. The evidence against me was overwhelming, convincing, and seemingly irrefutable. Audio recordings of my own voice, witness testimony from family members, and expert analysis all pointed to the same conclusion. But as I sat in my car afterward replaying the day's testimony, something bothered me about the recordings. The conversations sounded like things I might have thought during my most frustrated moments, but I had no memory of speaking them aloud. The vocal patterns were perfect, but the content felt slightly off, like someone had studied my speech and created conversations based on assumptions about my private thoughts. Mark Stevens interrupted my reflection by tapping on my car window. "We need to talk," he said grimly. "Victoria Hayes just informed me that tomorrow they're presenting evidence of your gambling addiction and showing how you systematically stole money from your grandmother to pay debts. If what she's claiming is true, you could be facing criminal charges in addition to losing the inheritance." I stared at him in disbelief. "I don't have a gambling addiction. I've never had gambling debts. This is getting completely insane." "That's what we're going to find out," Mark replied. "Because if these recordings are authentic and the financial evidence holds up, we might need to consider a plea agreement to avoid prison time." The reality of my situation crystallized as I drove home through the dark streets of Millbrook. Someone had spent extraordinary time and resources framing me for elder abuse fraud and financial manipulation. The evidence was so comprehensive and convincing that even my own lawyer was beginning to doubt my innocence. But I knew I was being framed, which meant someone else was responsible for destroying both my reputation and any chance of inheriting the money Grandma Dorothy had intended for me. Tomorrow would bring even more devastating evidence, and I was running out of time to prove my innocence before the entire case collapsed around me. The third day of trial opened with Victoria Hayes presenting financial records that painted me as a desperate gambler who had systematically stolen from our grandmother to fund an online poker addiction. The evidence appeared ironclad bank statements showing wire transfers to gambling websites, credit card charges for cash advances, and debt collection notices addressed to my apartment. Miss Henderson's gambling losses totaled $63,000 over 18 months, Victoria announced to the horrified jury. She funded this addiction by making unauthorized withdrawals from Mrs. Henderson's accounts, then manipulating the elderly woman into believing the money had been spent on legitimate medical expenses. I watched the jurors' faces as they studied transaction records that supposedly proved my financial desperation. Several members looked physically disgusted, and I realized that public opinion had already convicted me, regardless of the trial's outcome. Mark Stevens requested a recess to examine the new evidence, and during the break, I noticed him studying the financial documents with unusual intensity. His expression shifted from resignation to curiosity as he compared dates and transaction patterns. "Something's not right about these records," he murmured, spreading papers across the defense table. "The timing is too convenient, and some of these transactions occurred when you can prove you were somewhere else." "What do you mean?" I asked, desperate for any hope. "Look at this wire transfer to an online gambling site supposedly made from your laptop at 2:15 in the afternoon on November 3rd. But I have your signed statement that you were at the hospital with your grandmother during her emergency room visit that entire day." Mark's investigation revealed the first cracks in what had seemed like perfect evidence. Hospital records confirmed that Grandma Dorothy had been admitted for chest pains on November 3rd, and visitor logs showed I had arrived at 11 in the morning and stayed until 8 that evening. "This means someone else made that transaction using your identity," Mark concluded. "If we can prove one piece of evidence was fabricated, it raises questions about everything else." During the afternoon session, Mark began systematically challenging the financial evidence. He presented hospital records, pharmacy receipts, and witness statements that contradicted several supposed gambling transactions. "Your Honor, my client was provably at her grandmother's bedside during 3 of these alleged online gambling sessions," Mark argued. "Someone else has been using her identity to create this fraudulent financial trail." Victoria Hayes objected strenuously, claiming the hospital records were irrelevant to the larger pattern of financial abuse. But Judge Quinn seemed intrigued by the inconsistencies Mark had uncovered. As Mark continued his investigation, I began remembering strange details from Grandma Dorothy's final months that I had previously dismissed as coincidences. The mysterious phone calls she received late at night, always hanging up quickly when I entered the room. Her confusion about documents she had supposedly signed, insisting she had no memory of meeting with lawyers or financial advisors. "Mark, I think Rachel was visiting Grandma more often than anyone knew," I said during a brief recess. "There were times when I'd come home from grocery shopping and find evidence that someone had been in the house. Fresh coffee in a cup. Grandma couldn't have reached mail sorted differently than I had left it, things like that." "Why didn't you mention this before?" "I thought I was being paranoid. Grandma's memory was getting worse, and I assumed she was just confused about what she had and hadn't done." Mark's eyes lit up as he realized the implications. "If Rachel was making secret visits, she would have had access to your grandmother's personal information, financial documents, and private conversations. She could have been planning this frame-up for months." Our breakthrough came when Mark contacted the security company that had allegedly installed recording equipment in Grandma's house. After reviewing their records, the technician supervisor provided shocking information. "We never installed any audio recording devices in Dorothy Henderson's residence," he testified via phone conference. "Our contract was strictly for medical alert buttons and emergency response monitoring. Any audio recordings would have required separate equipment and legal disclosures that were never part of our agreement." Judge Quinn's expression hardened as he processed this revelation. "Are you telling the court that the audio recordings presented as evidence were not made by your company's equipment?" "That's correct, Your Honor. Based on the dates and technical specifications described, those recordings would have been made using different equipment entirely." Victoria Hayes scrambled to explain the discrepancy, claiming the family had hired additional security services independently. But when pressed for documentation, she could provide no contracts, invoices, or installation records for the alleged audio monitoring system. Mark requested an immediate technical analysis of the audio recordings, and Judge Quinn granted a one-day postponement to allow expert examination. The courtroom buzzed with speculation as the implications became clear. If the recordings were fabricated, the entire prosecution case would collapse. That evening, Mark contacted Dr. James Richardson, a forensic audio analyst who specialized in detecting artificially generated speech. Dr. Richardson's preliminary examination revealed disturbing inconsistencies in the recordings that had seemed so convincing. These audio files show signs of digital manipulation, Dr. Richardson explained during an emergency hearing. The vocal patterns are consistent with artificial intelligence voice synthesis technology. Someone used sample recordings of Ms. Henderson's natural speech to generate these conversations artificially. The revelation hit the courtroom like a bomb. Artificial intelligence voice cloning technology had become sophisticated enough to create convincing fake audio using relatively small samples of someone's natural speech. Phone conversations, voicemail messages, or social media videos could provide enough vocal data to generate completely fabricated recordings. How much sample audio would be needed to create these fake conversations? Judge Quinn asked. With current technology, as little as 10 to 15 minutes of clear speech samples could generate hours of artificial dialogue, Dr. Richardson replied. The technology is commercially available and relatively affordable for someone with basic technical knowledge. Victoria Hayes objected vehemently to the technical analysis, claiming the experts' conclusions were speculative and unproven. But Dr. Richardson's credentials were impeccable, and his analysis included detailed spectrograms showing digital artifacts consistent with artificial voice generation. Mark pressed his advantage by examining the timeline of evidence collection. Your Honor, if these recordings are artificial, it raises serious questions about who had access to Ms. Henderson's voice samples and the technical expertise to create such sophisticated fake evidence. Furthermore, Mark continued, we need to examine whether other evidence in this case has been similarly fabricated. If someone was willing to create fake audio recordings, what other evidence might be artificially generated or manipulated? Judge Quinn ordered a comprehensive review of all evidence presented by the plaintiff, including the banking record security footage and witness statements. The trial was postponed for 1 week to allow thorough forensic examination of every document and recording. As we left the courtroom that day, I felt the first genuine hope I had experienced since this nightmare began. The perfect evidence that had seemed so convincing was beginning to unravel under closer scrutiny. Whoever did this to you is extremely sophisticated, Mark warned as we walked to our cars. Voice cloning technology, identity theft, financial manipulation, and coordinated witness testimony represent a level of planning that goes far beyond typical family disputes. It has to be Rachel, I replied. She's the only one with access to family information and enough motivation to go to these lengths. Maybe, Mark said thoughtfully, but creating this level of fabricated evidence requires technical expertise, financial resources, and criminal connections that go beyond what most people can access independently. Your sister might have help from someone with extensive experience in fraud and identity theft. That night, I reviewed everything I knew about my family's finances and relationships, searching for clues about how Rachel could have orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The answer, when it came, would prove more shocking than anything I had imagined about my sister's capacity for betrayal. The week-long postponement gave Mark Stevens the opportunity to conduct the most thorough investigation of his legal career. What he discovered would fundamentally change our understanding of the case and reveal a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond a simple inheritance dispute. Dr. Richardson's detailed audio analysis confirmed that all the incriminating recordings had been artificially generated using advanced voice synthesis technology. The spectrograms revealed digital fingerprints consistent with software called VoiceForge, a commercial product marketed to content creators, but capable of producing incredibly realistic fake speech. The artificial intelligence model was trained using approximately 47 minutes of Miss Henderson's natural speech. Dr. Richardson testified when court resumed. This sample could have been compiled from phone conversations, video calls, or social media content recorded over several months. Mark had subpoenaed Rachel's electronic devices and discovered a deleted folder containing hours of secretly recorded phone conversations between me and various family members. The recordings dated back 3 years, suggesting the frame-up had been planned long before Grandma Dorothy's death. Your Honor, we found evidence that Miss Rachel Henderson purchased VoiceForge software 18 months ago using a prepaid credit card, Mark announced. Technical support logs show multiple training sessions where she uploaded audio files and generated test conversations. Victoria Hayes' objections became increasingly desperate as Mark systematically dismantled the prosecution's evidence. The security footage from the bank was revealed to be Rachel wearing a wig and clothing similar to my usual outfits. Traffic cameras captured her rental car in the bank's parking lot during 2 of the alleged visits, despite her sworn testimony that she had been in California during those dates. The financial evidence proved even more damaging to Rachel's credibility. Mark's forensic accountant discovered that the online gambling transactions had been made using a virtual private network that masked the true location of the computer. The IP address trail led to an internet cafe in Los Angeles, just 6 blocks from Rachel's apartment. Miss Henderson was never physically present for any of these supposed gambling sessions, Mark explained to the jury. Someone else used her stolen identity information to create a false history of financial desperation and addiction. But the most shocking revelation came when Mark investigated the private investigator who had supposedly uncovered evidence against me. James Mallory claimed to be a licensed investigator hired by Rachel to examine my behavior, but state licensing records showed no such person existed. James Mallory is a fictitious identity, Mark announced. The real investigator is Thomas Brennan, who has been convicted twice for insurance fraud and identity theft. He specializes in creating false evidence for civil litigation and divorce cases. Judge Quinn's anger was obvious as he questioned Thomas Brennan under oath. Did you knowingly create fabricated evidence in this case? I was hired to build a comprehensive case, Brennan replied evasively. My client provided background information and asked me to document a pattern of elder abuse and financial manipulation. Did you verify the accuracy of this background information? That wasn't part of my contracted services. I was paid to create supporting documentation for claims that had already been made. Mark pressed harder. Mr. Brennan, did you personally witness any of the alleged abuse or manipulation described in your report? No, but I had access to what appeared to be credible evidence from family members and medical professionals. Evidence that you now acknowledge was fabricated. Thomas Brennan's silence spoke volumes. Judge Quinn held him in contempt and ordered criminal charges for perjury and evidence tampering. The courtroom atmosphere had completely shifted. What had seemed like an ironclad case against me was revealed as an elaborate criminal conspiracy involving multiple felonies: identity theft, fraud, perjury, and elder abuse. But Mark's investigation was far from complete. His research into Rachel's financial situation revealed devastating information about her true motives and criminal history. Your Honor, I need to present evidence about Miss Rachel Henderson's financial desperation and previous criminal activity, Mark announced during an emergency session. Objection, Victoria Hayes called out. My client's financial situation is irrelevant to the charges against Miss Charity Henderson. Judge Quinn overruled the objection. Given the evidence of fabricated testimony and forged documents, I want to understand all possible motives for this alleged conspiracy. Mark's financial investigator had uncovered a trail of debt and failed investments that painted a devastating picture of Rachel's true situation. Her acting career was not just struggling, it was non-existent. She had not worked professionally in over 2 years and was facing eviction from her Los Angeles apartment. Miss Rachel Henderson owes $68,000 in credit card debt, $12,000 in back rent, and has defaulted on multiple loans. Mark testified. She was served with bankruptcy papers 3 weeks before initiating this inheritance dispute. The evidence showed that Rachel had borrowed money from multiple sources, including payday loan companies and illegal lending operations. She was being threatened with legal action by at least 4 creditors, and her bank accounts had been frozen due to suspected check fraud. Furthermore, Mark continued, we discovered that this is not the first time Miss Rachel Henderson has attempted inheritance fraud. 5 years ago, she was investigated for similar allegations against a great-aunt in Arizona, though charges were never filed due to insufficient evidence. Victoria Hayes looked stricken as Mark presented documentation from the Arizona case. The pattern was identical claims of elder manipulation, forged documents, and false witness testimony designed to contest a legitimate will. In Arizona, Miss Henderson alleged that her great-aunt Margaret had been manipulated by a cousin who provided end-of-life care. She hired the same private investigator, Thomas Brennan, and used similar voice synthesis technology to create false evidence. Judge Quinn's expression hardened as he reviewed the Arizona documents. Why were charges never filed in that case? The great-aunt died during the investigation, and family members chose to settle out of court rather than pursue criminal charges. Miss Henderson received a substantial settlement despite the questionable nature of her claims. The implications were staggering. Rachel had successfully used these same tactics before targeting elderly family members and their caregivers. She had refined her methods over 5 years, perfecting the technology and legal strategies needed to steal inheritances through systematic fraud. Mark's final revelation proved most damaging of all. Court records showed that my parents had been involved in the Arizona case as well, providing witness testimony against the cousin who had cared for great-aunt Margaret. This was not an isolated incident, Mark concluded. We are dealing with a criminal enterprise that has operated successfully for at least 5 years, targeting elderly family members and their caregivers through sophisticated fraud schemes. The courtroom fell silent as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about Grandma Dorothy's inheritance. It was about a pattern of elder abuse and fraud that had victimized multiple family members across several states. Judge Quinn called for an immediate recess to review all evidence and determine appropriate criminal charges. Rachel's confident demeanor had completely disappeared, replaced by the pale anxiety of someone whose elaborate deception had been thoroughly exposed. Victoria Hayes approached Mark during the break, her professional composure finally cracking. "We need to discuss a settlement," she said quietly. "My client may be willing to withdraw all claims in exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution." Mark's response was immediate and firm. "Your client is facing federal charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Any plea negotiations will need to include full restitution and cooperation with ongoing criminal investigations." As court prepared to resume, I realized that the nightmare was finally ending. But the revelations about my family's criminal history meant that justice would extend far beyond this single inheritance dispute. Rachel and my parents would face serious criminal consequences for their years of systematic fraud and manipulation. When court resumed, Mark Stevens presented evidence that would shatter any remaining illusions about my family's integrity. His investigation had uncovered a multi-state criminal enterprise that had been operating successfully for over 5 years, targeting vulnerable elderly relatives through sophisticated fraud schemes. "Your Honor, I need to present evidence about a pattern of criminal behavior that goes far beyond this single inheritance dispute," Mark announced as he arranged several boxes of documents on our table. Judge Quinn leaned forward with obvious interest. "Proceed, Mr. Stevens." In December of 2018, Mrs. Margaret Henderson, the defendant's great-aunt, died in Phoenix, Arizona, under circumstances remarkably similar to what we've seen in this case. Mark distributed copies of court documents to the jury and opposing counsel. Mrs. Margaret Henderson left an estate valued at $400,000 to her nephew David, who had provided her with care during her final 3 years of life. Miss Rachel Henderson contested this will using allegations identical to those we've heard in this courtroom. The Arizona case files revealed a pattern so similar to our current situation that coincidence was impossible. Rachel had claimed that David manipulated their great-aunt, isolated her from family, and forged documents to increase his inheritance. She hired Thomas Brennan to investigate and used voice synthesis technology to create fake evidence. The Arizona case featured audio recordings of David supposedly admitting to elder abuse banking records, showing suspicious transactions and witness testimony from family members claiming manipulation and isolation. Mark explained. Every element of that case has been repeated here with different names and locations. Victoria Hayes objected strenuously, arguing that events in Arizona were irrelevant to the current case, but Judge Quinn overruled her, noting that pattern evidence was essential to understanding the full scope of the alleged conspiracy. Mr. Stevens, what was the outcome of the Arizona litigation? The case was settled out of court after Mrs. Margaret Henderson died during the investigation. Miss Rachel Henderson received a payment of $125,000 despite the questionable nature of her claims. David chose to settle rather than face prolonged litigation while grieving his aunt's death. Mark's documentation showed that my parents had actively participated in the Arizona fraud, providing witness testimony about David's alleged manipulation and flying to Phoenix to support Rachel's claims. They had used the same performance of grief and reluctant testimony that I had witnessed in our current courtroom. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have evidence suggesting that this criminal enterprise extends to other elderly family members as well. Mark presented financial records showing mysterious payments to Rachel from 3 different relatives over the past 7 years. Mrs. Dorothy Henderson's sister Louise made payments totaling $18,000 to Miss Rachel Henderson just months before Louise's death in 2020. Mrs. Elizabeth Henderson, another relative, made similar payments before her death in 2019. In each case, the payments occurred shortly after Miss Henderson visited these elderly women. The pattern was chilling. Rachel had been systematically targeting elderly family members using emotional manipulation and financial pressure to extract money before their deaths. When formal inheritances were involved, she escalated to fraud and forgery to maximize her profits. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychiatrist specializing in elder abuse, testified about the psychological manipulation techniques revealed in Rachel's communications with our relatives. Ms. Henderson demonstrated sophisticated understanding of vulnerability factors in elderly adults. Dr. Walsh explained. Her approach involved isolation tactics, dependency creation, and systematic undermining of relationships with other family members. Can you give us specific examples? In recorded conversations with Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, we see Miss Rachel Henderson repeatedly suggesting that other family members didn't care about her, creating artificial urgency around financial decisions and positioning herself as the only trustworthy family member. Mark played carefully selected portions of genuine recordings recovered from Rachel's devices, showing her manipulating our grandmother during secret visits. Her voice was gentle but insidious as she planted seeds of doubt about my motives and dedication. Grandma, I'm worried about Charity's financial situation. She seems really stressed about money lately, and I don't want you to feel pressured to help her out. Maybe we should talk about protecting your assets so she doesn't feel tempted to borrow anything. The recordings revealed months of careful psychological manipulation designed to turn Grandma Dorothy against me while positioning Rachel as the protective granddaughter. She'd been planning this inheritance theft long before Grandma's health declined seriously. Mark's financial investigator provided additional evidence of the criminal enterprise's scope and sophistication. Ms. Henderson's bank records show payments from at least 7 elderly relatives over 5 years, totaling approximately $300,000. These payments follow a consistent pattern: initial small amounts for supposed emergencies, followed by larger transfers for investments or medical expenses, culminating in substantial final payments shortly before the relative's death. The evidence showed that Rachel had been running inheritance fraud as a full-time occupation, supporting herself entirely through elderly family member manipulation and estate theft. Her supposed acting career was a cover story that allowed her to travel between states and target relatives systematically. Judge Quinn's expression grew darker as Mark presented evidence of the conspiracy's planning and coordination. Email exchanges between Rachel and my parents revealed detailed discussions about which relatives to target and how to maximize financial outcomes. "We need to be more careful about the timing," my mother had written in an email to Rachel. Margaret's situation worked out well, but we don't want to establish a pattern that draws attention from authorities. My father's emails were even more damning. "Dorothy is the biggest opportunity we'll have, but Charity's presence complicates everything. We need to document a clear case of manipulation and isolation before proceeding with any will contests." The revelation that my parents had been active participants in the criminal conspiracy was devastating. They weren't reluctant witnesses testifying against a daughter who had gone astray. They were co-conspirators who had helped plan my destruction for financial gain. Mark's investigation revealed that my parents' retirement community in Florida was facing financial difficulties, and they owed significant money in back fees and assessments. Their comfortable retirement was largely financed by money stolen from elderly relatives through Rachel's fraud schemes. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson have received approximately $47,000 in direct payments from Miss Rachel Henderson over the past 3 years, Mark testified. These payments coincided with their most significant financial pressures and preceded their active participation in this inheritance fraud. The courtroom atmosphere had become surreal. What began as a family inheritance dispute had evolved into the exposure of a multi-state criminal enterprise involving systematic elder abuse fraud and identity theft. Victoria Hayes made one final desperate attempt to salvage her case by arguing that the Arizona evidence was prejudicial and irrelevant. But Judge Quinn was clearly convinced that he was dealing with career criminals rather than a family struggling with grief and financial disputes. "Mr. Stevens, I want to hear your conclusions about the scope of this alleged criminal conspiracy," Judge Quinn said. "Your Honor, the evidence shows that Miss Rachel Henderson, with the active assistance of Robert and Susan Henderson, has been operating a sophisticated inheritance fraud scheme targeting elderly family members across multiple states. They have used voice synthesis technology, identity theft, document forgery, and perjury to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from vulnerable relatives. Furthermore, this conspiracy specifically targeted my client because her genuine care and sacrifice for Mrs. Dorothy Henderson threatened their planned inheritance theft. They systematically isolated my client, destroyed her reputation, and attempted to send her to prison to cover their own crimes." Mark's final statement was devastating in its clarity. "This is not a family dispute, Your Honor. This is organized crime specifically designed to victimize elderly Americans and their legitimate caregivers." As Mark concluded his presentation, I looked across the courtroom at my family and realized that I had never really known them at all. The people I had trusted and loved were strangers who had been planning my destruction, while I sacrificed everything to care for our grandmother. Judge Quinn called for a recess to review the evidence and determine appropriate charges. When court resumed, his decision would not only resolve our inheritance dispute, but expose a criminal conspiracy that had victimized elderly people across multiple states for years. Judge Quinn's return to the courtroom marked the beginning of the most satisfying moment of my life. His expression was stern as he reviewed his notes, and the packed gallery sat in complete silence, waiting for his decision. In 42 years on the bench, I have never encountered a more systematic and callous conspiracy to defraud elderly citizens and destroy innocent family members. Judge Quinn began. The evidence presented reveals a criminal enterprise that has operated across state lines with sophisticated planning and complete disregard for human decency. He turned to address Rachel directly. Miss Rachel Henderson, you have committed multiple felonies, including wire fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, perjury, and conspiracy. Your actions represent not just crimes against your family, but crimes against every vulnerable elderly person who depends on family members for care and protection. Rachel's face had gone completely pale. Victoria Hayes gripped her client's arm as Judge Quinn continued his devastating assessment. The court finds that the audio recordings presented as evidence were artificially generated using voice synthesis technology with the deliberate intent to frame Miss Charity Henderson for crimes she did not commit. The banking records, witness testimony, and investigative reports were similarly fabricated as part of a comprehensive fraud scheme. Judge Quinn's voice grew harder as he addressed my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, your participation in this conspiracy is particularly reprehensible. You have betrayed not only your daughter, but the memory of Dorothy Henderson, who trusted you to protect her legacy and honor her final wishes. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Rachel's inheritance claim was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she could never challenge Grandma Dorothy's will again. All legal fees and court costs were assessed against her, and she was ordered to pay punitive damages of $100,000 for fraud and emotional distress. Furthermore, Judge Quinn announced, I am referring this matter to the FBI for federal prosecution under interstate wire fraud and elder abuse statutes. Similar charges will be filed against Robert and Susan Henderson for their role in this conspiracy. But the judge wasn't finished. He'd uncovered something during his independent investigation that nobody in the courtroom expected, including Mark and myself. During the course of this trial, I took the unusual step of conducting my own review of property and tax records related to Dorothy Henderson's estate. What I discovered raises additional questions about the true nature of Mrs. Henderson's final wishes. Judge Quinn produced a sealed envelope from his desk. 3 days ago, I was contacted by Mr. Harold Pemberton, Mrs. Henderson's longtime attorney, who informed me that Mrs. Henderson had left additional instructions to be opened only in the event of a will contest or family dispute. My heart raced as Judge Quinn opened the envelope and read its contents silently. His expression shifted from stern to something approaching amazement. Mrs. Henderson apparently suspected that her death might trigger exactly the kind of dispute we have witnessed. She prepared a detailed letter explaining her intentions and providing evidence that she had been secretly documenting Rachel's manipulation attempts for months. The letter, written in Grandma Dorothy's careful handwriting, was devastating in its clarity and detail. She had known about Rachel's previous fraud in Arizona and suspected that similar tactics might be used against me after her death. My dear Charity, Judge Quinn read aloud, if this letter is being read in court, it means that Rachel has done exactly what I feared she would do. I want everyone to know that you never manipulated me or influenced my decisions. You sacrificed your life to care for me, and I chose to leave you everything because you earned it through love and dedication. The letter continued with specific details about Rachel's secret visits and attempts to manipulate financial decisions. Grandma Dorothy had been far more aware of the family dynamics than anyone realized, and she had been protecting me even from beyond the grave. Furthermore, Judge Quinn continued reading, I have been recording Rachel's visits and phone calls for the past 6 months, using equipment that Mr. Pemberton helped me install secretly. These recordings are stored in a safety deposit box at First National Bank under account number 47932. They will prove that Rachel has been planning to contest my will and destroy Charity's reputation. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations as the full scope of Grandma Dorothy's foresight became clear. She had been conducting her own investigation while pretending to be a confused elderly woman vulnerable to manipulation. Judge Quinn ordered the safety deposit box opened immediately, and its contents provided the final pieces of evidence needed to destroy Rachel's credibility completely. Hours of authentic recordings showed Rachel systematically attempting to manipulate Grandma Dorothy while our grandmother played along to document the manipulation attempts. In one particularly damning recording, Rachel could be heard saying, "Grandma, we need to talk about Charity. I think she's planning to take advantage of your will situation. Maybe we should make some changes to protect you from her influence." Grandma Dorothy's response revealed her true awareness. "Rachel, dear, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I know exactly what you're trying to do, and I want you to know that everything I own will go to Charity because she's the only one who has ever cared about me rather than my money." The recordings included conversations where Rachel explicitly discussed her plans to contest the will using fabricated evidence. She had unknowingly provided Grandma Dorothy with complete documentation of her criminal intentions. With this evidence, Judge Quinn's final ruling was inevitable. "Miss Charity Henderson, you are hereby awarded the entire estate of Dorothy Henderson, including all real property, financial assets, and personal belongings. Additionally, you are awarded punitive damages totaling $250,000 to be paid jointly by Rachel Robert and Susan Henderson. Furthermore, Rachel Henderson is banned from contacting Miss Charity Henderson or entering Genesee County for 5 years. Any violation of this order will result in immediate imprisonment." The criminal implications were equally severe. Federal agents arrested Rachel in the courtroom as Judge Quinn concluded his ruling. My parents were taken into custody for questioning, and Victoria Hayes was being investigated by the State Bar Association for potential involvement in the fraud conspiracy. Over the following months, the full scope of the criminal enterprise became public. Rachel was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for elder abuse and wire fraud. My parents received 3 years each and were ordered to pay full restitution to all identified victims. The Arizona case was reopened, resulting in additional charges and the return of stolen money to David, our cousin, who had been victimized 5 years earlier. Similar investigations were launched in 3 other states where Rachel had targeted elderly relatives. Thomas Brennan, the fake private investigator, received 5 years for evidence tampering and was ordered to pay restitution to multiple victims of his fabricated evidence schemes. With my inheritance secured and my reputation restored, I used Grandma Dorothy's money to establish the Dorothy Henderson Foundation for Elder Protection, focusing on preventing the kind of abuse that my family had perpetrated against multiple relatives. The foundation provides legal assistance to elderly Americans facing inheritance fraud funds, research into voice synthesis, technology abuse, and trains social workers to recognize sophisticated manipulation tactics used by family members against vulnerable elderly relatives. Jake Morrison contacted me after seeing news coverage of the trial. "I always knew you were innocent," he said during our first phone conversation in 3 years. "What you did for your grandmother was beautiful, and I'm sorry I didn't support you better when you needed it." We began rebuilding our relationship slowly with the understanding that my experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I was stronger now, more cautious about trust, but also more appreciative of genuine loyalty and love. The house where I had cared for Grandma Dorothy became a regional training center for elder care professionals. I kept her bedroom exactly as she had left it, filled with photos of our family from happier times when I believed we were united by love rather than divided by greed. Mrs. Caldwell, our former neighbor who had testified against me, apologized tearfully after learning the truth about Rachel's manipulation. "She told us that you were keeping Dorothy isolated and that we needed to help protect her," she explained. "We thought we were doing the right thing." I forgave her because I understood how convincing Rachel could be. She had spent years perfecting her manipulation techniques on vulnerable elderly relatives, and she had used those same skills to turn neighbors and friends against me. The most meaningful moment came when I received a call from David, our cousin who had been victimized in Arizona. "Thank you for exposing them," he said simply. Aunt Margaret would be so proud of what you've accomplished." Through the Dorothy Henderson Foundation, I met dozens of other families who had experienced similar elder abuse and inheritance fraud. Their stories reinforced my understanding that Rachel's crimes were part of a larger epidemic of elder financial exploitation that often goes undetected until it's too late. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from Rachel in federal prison. She attempted to apologize and explain her actions, claiming financial desperation and poor judgment. But her letter revealed no genuine remorse, only frustration at being caught and punished for crimes she had apparently considered victimless. I never responded to her letter. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and some people are too dangerous to trust again. Rachel had shown me her true nature over 8 years of careful planning and systematic deception. Instead, I focused on honoring Grandma Dorothy's memory through meaningful work that would prevent other families from experiencing the pain and betrayal that had nearly destroyed my life. Every elderly person we helped through the foundation represented a victory against the kind of predatory behavior that my family had practiced for years. My story taught me that true family bonds are built through consistent love and sacrifice rather than shared DNA. Grandma Dorothy had been more of a mother to me than my actual mother, and her final protection of my inheritance proved that genuine love transcends death itself. The Foundation's work revealed how often elderly Americans are victimized by their own family members, who view them as financial opportunities rather than human beings deserving respect and protection. Technology has made these crimes easier to commit and harder to detect, requiring new legal protections and investigation techniques. Today, I wake up each morning in a small apartment near the Foundation's offices, surrounded by thank you letters from families we've helped and photos of Grandma Dorothy during our happiest moments together. My life has purpose and meaning that I never could have found in my original marketing career. The $2 million Grandma Dorothy left me has been invested wisely, providing financial security while funding important work that makes a real difference in people's lives. Money that Rachel tried to steal through fraud now protects other elderly Americans from similar exploitation. Sometimes I drive past the house where Grandma Dorothy and I spent 8 years together now, busy with training activities and educational programs. I can almost hear her laughter echoing from the kitchen, where we baked cookies every Sunday afternoon, and I feel grateful that her final gift to me was not just financial security, but the knowledge that love and sacrifice are always rewarded, even when justice seems impossible. The greatest lesson from this experience is that when we care for others without expecting reward, the universe finds ways to honor that love. Grandma Dorothy's protection extended beyond her death, ensuring that truth would eventually triumph over even the most sophisticated deception. Rachel's elaborate fraud ultimately failed because it was built on lies, while my relationship with Grandma Dorothy was built on genuine love and mutual respect. Truth has a power that no amount of technology or criminal sophistication can overcome permanently. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely, and how did you find the strength to rebuild your life afterward? Your experiences might help others who are facing similar challenges with family manipulation or elder abuse. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help others find these important lessons about family loyalty and protecting our elderly loved ones. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding justice in difficult situations. Share this with anyone who might be dealing with elder abuse or inheritance disputes, because awareness and support can make all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it brings you strength to face whatever challenges you're confronting in your own life.